I was recently asked which books have had the greatest influence on me. Now, apart from those of Nietzsche, no surprise there, one title stood out: Systems of Survival by the late Canadian economist Jane Jacobs. This book proposes a very interesting model for the ideal community, based loosely on Jacobs' reading of Plato's Republic. By looking at how people deal with their needs, she divided up humanity into two groups, each with radically differing value systems. She calls them moral syndromes. The first produces and trades. This is the commercial syndrome. It includes the occupations that produce and supply our physical needs. The second scavenges and takes. This is the guardian syndrome. Those who maintain the cohesion and coherence of society. Now, in order to trade effectively, commerce needs the guardians, both to ward off predators and to lay down and enforce standards of probity. The costs of this service are then paid for from the profits of commerce, a form of symbiosis between the two syndromes. Now, throughout most of human history, trade and guardianship were rigidly separated, a moral stance that has been totally ignored for the past few centuries. Medieval orders of chivalry barred any man whose parent, grandparent, or great grandparent was a merchant. Usury, the lending of money at interest, was singled as particularly repugnant. This is why it was left to communities on the margins of society to undertake this necessary but distasteful chore of money lending. The slaves of ancient Athens did it, and the Jews in medieval Europe. Now, Jacobs compared the two syndromes and concluded that each had its own code of ethics. These codes are not only distinct from one another, but also they are often mutually incompatible, as can be seen in this list taken from her book. First, commerce will shun force, whereas guardians shun trading. Totally separate. Trade comes to voluntary agreements, whereas guardians exert prowess to get their way. 3. Those in trade have to be honest to maintain the trust of partners, whereas to guardians such honesty is secondary to being obedient to authority and being disciplined. In order to facilitate and expand business, traders collaborate easily with strangers and aliens. Guardians adhere to the traditions of their group and mistrust outsiders. 5. Traders respect the notion of competition, whereas guardians respect hierarchy. Traders must respect and uphold contracts, whereas guardians see loyalty as the dominant virtue. Traders use initiative and enterprise to prosper, whereas guardians show strength and take vengeance. Traders are open to inventiveness and novelty to succeed in the task at hand, whereas guardians will deceive. Traders benefit by being efficient, whereas guardians make rich use of leisure. Efficiency doesn't come into it. Traders promote comfort and convenience, whereas guardians are ostentatious in the extreme. Traders dissent for the sake of the task, whereas guardians dispense largesse. Traders invest for productive purposes, guardians value exclusivity. Traders value being industrious, whereas guardians value showing fortitude. Traders are thrifty in their dealings, whereas guardians are fatalistic. Traders are optimistic in outlook, whereas guardians treasure honor above all. Quite different set of ethics for both groups. Jacobs says a society is healthy when the members from these two syndromes coexist in harmony. However, she warns that you can't mix up such contradictory moral syndromes without opening up moral abysses and producing all kinds of functional messes. She states her law of intractable systemic corruption. Any compromise to the ethical standards of a particular syndrome, say by employing the ethics of the other, will corrupt the first syndrome's integrity. The expediency needed to function in a world of distorted values converts some virtues into vices, or at the very least, individuals become morally inconsistent hypocrites. Jacob's book is full of examples. The transfer of titles and property from father to son is perfectly acceptable in aristocratic societies. But in commercial groups, this is often considered nepotism. The mafia was originally formed to protect the Sicilian community from exploitation by its political elite. Only when they moved in on trade to fund their operating costs did their guardian attitudes trigger the Cosa Nostra's mutation into a monstrous moral hybrid. Then their definition of trade began to involve intimidation and bribery. Commercial planning for guardian priorities, as in the Soviet Union, indeed all socialist states, leads to a collapse of commercial endeavour. Mikhail Gorbachev summed it up beautifully. They pretend to work and we pretend to pay them. By the same token, the imposition of commercial measures will inevitably corrupt the guardian's sense of honour. Placing key performance indicators on police officers will lead them to fitting up innocents so they meet their targets, or they let guilty parties go free for the greater good. Practicing guardianship under commercial precepts can lead to ethical dilemmas. Legal systems across the world see nothing wrong in plea bargaining. The accused plead guilty to a lesser charge to save the cost of an expensive trial. However, it ends up with innocents pleading guilty rather than risk both the lottery of a trial and the huge costs of legal fees to themselves. Paradoxically, convicted criminals are routinely set free after only serving a fraction of their sentence because the cost of jailing them has become prohibitive. Now, Paul Condon, head of the Metropolitan Police for most of the 1990s, coined the phrase noble cause corruption. This was when officers felt justified in bending the rules to get a conviction of a career criminal, even though they had no proof. By the same token, criminals were let off charges provided they traded the names of other criminals or were charged with lesser offences if they admitted to a string of offences, many of which they didn't do, just so that the police clean-up rate would improve. Jacobs herself describes how officers from the New York Transport Police falsely arrested innocent African American and Hispanic men systematically, just so their productivity measures, arrests per working hour, look good. It all came to light when they booked an off-duty policeman. Such noble cause corruption is coursing through the veins of Britain's HMRC and the US IRS. Virtuous with indignation, tax collectors in their respective high net worth units are targeting the rich and see nothing wrong in assuming they are guilty until proven innocent. Actually, they assume the rich are automatically guilty just by being rich. There have been examples of officials sending out arbitrary tax commands and then insisting that the target must pay up or go to jail, and that it's the target's problem to prove there was overcharging and then claim back the excess. Now, imagine what would happen if this process was incentivized. What if the tax collectors receive a percentage of every extra dollar, pound, euro that they pull into the treasury coffers? Yet again, we would see Jacob's law of intractable systemic corruption in operation, and tax collectors would revert to the archetypal social pariahs known from the Bible. Performance measures are always problematic. In 2008, the Guardian newspaper uncovered a scandal in the British National Health Service. In order to grab the headlines, the government had promised that all patients would be treated within 4 hours of admission to hospital accident and emergency units. Unfortunately, there are certain peak times when this is just not possible. All across the UK, so as not to transgress the targets, thousands of seriously ill patients were forced to wait aboard the ambulances parked in holding patterns outside the overstretched hospitals. Ambulances were now mobile waiting rooms, technically outside of the official system, so we're not breaking any rules. Unfortunately, this so-called patient stacking placed the patient's health at risk, but also meant that ambulances and crews were not available to answer new emergencies. Likewise, the stressing of commercial priorities contaminates guardianship, as when politics becomes a profession and politicians display no sense of pride and no sense of shame. According to P.J.O'Rourke, when buying and selling are controlled by legislation, the first things to be bought and sold are the legislators. Ogden Nash hit it on the head. Professional people have no cares. Whatever happens, they get theirs. When the normal practices of a group, whether a guardian or a trader, diverge from the ethics of its syndrome, then virtue and vice become indistinguishable. The rules of the game lose all meaning. The 2009 scandal of British MPs fraudulently receiving substantial expenses claims is a classic example. Most of the disgraced MPs saw nothing wrong with what they were doing because they were operating within the letter of the law, but not within the spirit. For example, Sir Peter Viggers used taxpayers' money to furnish a duck house on the family lake. And Jackie Smith, the then Home Secretary, and she had the role of overseeing law and order in the UK. She reclaimed amounts both small, the cost of hiring pornographic movies, and large, declaring her sister's house in London as her second home, and thus making it chargeable. Jane Jacobs makes it totally clear that no single system of morality can accommodate both guardianship and commerce. Taking and trading are two fundamentally different syndromes. Mixing them up eventually must create enormous tensions, but not straight away. A series of minor misdemeanors, each in itself trivial, inconvenient, useful even, are the first steps on the road to perdition. No alarm bells ring, but whenever a nice little wheeze is copied, or there are variations on a theme, society gradually slides into full-blown corruption. Drip, 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 until the floodgates open. Then the guardians, instead of being the source of standards and the punisher of wrongdoers, are corrupt and corrupting. Meanwhile, the traders are making you an offer you can't refuse. Who guards the guardians when morality collapses into vice. Now, in Britain, for decades, guardians and traders have been living in each other's pockets. Traders continually lobby governments to influence policies, and in return, retired politicians hoover up company directorships. The honours system has turned into a circus. Ask yourself, what are honours for? Originally, they were the fancy baubles that peacock guardians gifted to themselves as personal rewards, all for the self-aggrandizement of their class. Honours were kept well away from the commercial class, which was deliberately excluded from any pomp and ceremony. The accumulation of profits was to be that class's only reward. However, nowadays, when the likes of businessmen, pop singers and sportsmen, all individuals from the trading class, are made lords and knights of the realm, and a few lesser trinkets are distributed as crumbs to the peasants, then clearly the law of intractable systemic corruption has been institutionalized into the British way of life. Cash for honours is the order of the day. Lloyd George, when he was Prime Minister, was notorious for it. Why is anyone surprised when the managers of Prince Charles's Charitable Foundation are accused of offering citizenship and honours to a Saudi billionaire in return for a large donation? Don't look too closely at just how many political donors from the business world have been ennobled. Like I said, it's a circus, a joke, a pathetic charade, no different to the archetypal South American dictators who are ridiculously dolled up in bemedaled uniforms. Thank you, Jane Jacobs, for pointing all this out.